This is part one of our anniversary month Liberation Dialogues. Part one, we seek to deal with church history from 1953 basically to 1973, just before we launched into expansion. And so we have, I don't know if I need to introduce our presiding Bishop, Jaramogi Mendeleke Kimathi. Amen. There's 1,000 questions we could ask, but we're just going to keep it at 3. And the first question I wanted to ask you was about our founder. He was legendary before the shrine was even founded. But the story of the founding, when he preached his last sermon and he walked out of that church and 300 people followed, you had said in several sermons that we had kind of romanticized that view of it, but it was way more difficult for Jaramogi than we say. Can you expound on that?
I have a microphone. This is something that he said. One day we were discussing the romantic, glamorized version of him preaching his last sermon defiantly and walking out of the church. And it was a glorious and beautiful moment when 300 people got up and walked out with him and decided to establish another church. But he explained that it was not like that. It was very heart-wrenching. It was heart-wrenching and very difficult because Detroit, where Shrine One was a community, and it was basically an upper middle class community. And these were people who were tight. They had known each other for a long period of time. Their families knew each other. They lived together. There weren't many places where affluent black people could actually live. So it was almost like a small town in the sense that they were all interconnected. And when this issue of this white denomination trying to tell a black church how it ought to carry out its business, it grew in resentment and hostility over time. And the church basically split behind those that wanted Jaramogi's vision of what a church should be and those that wanted a more traditional kind of church. So there was a lot of animosity and hard feeling. And he said that he didn't mean to split the church. He meant to leave. As a matter of fact, he got fired. He got fired, and he was preaching his last sermon. He had been fired earlier in the week. And he said that when he preached his last sermon, he gave a vision of what he thought a church ought to be. And when he didn't want to sit around and wait for the right hand of fellowship, when he finished preaching, he just walked out of the pulpit in his robe and walked down the middle aisle, and he walked out of the church, and he was through. What he didn't anticipate was that 300 members were going to get up and walk out with him. And that became the beginning of the shrine.
Thank you for that. Now, Jaramogi Bebe Ajman has a special place in our hearts because he's the founder of our church. We know probably more than others about his history and story, but why do you think just the general public, black people in particular, know so little about him and about his importance and the importance of our church? Our church, it's beloved to us, but our church, our movement has more of an impact nationally and internationally. And why do you think there's such a low level of understanding of that?
Well, I think that's basically by design. I mean, we've been notoriously inept at blowing our own horn, at bragging on our own selves. And that comes from a time when our struggle, as we conceived it, was not trying to convince the public of anything. It was not an outward struggle. It was an inward struggle in which we were trying to inwardly build institutions, to build power, to have programs. And so basically we were calling people into us rather than taking ourselves out to them. I know that one of the things that affected that process was the COINTELPRO, the FBI counterintelligence program, where Jaramogi was always saying we got to stay below the radar. We're becoming way too successful, way too economically independent, and we're expanding. We got to stay below the radar because they're cracking down on black organizations. And so at the time that we were expanding was at the heyday of COINTELPRO. So we didn't make a lot of big public pronouncements about what we were doing and the significance of it. The people that really appreciate Jaramogi were those that directly benefited from his leadership, and theologians, people in churches. They really recognize his contribution and how he pretty much single-handedly changed the black church and its focus, like stretched them to go into places they wouldn't never have thought about going into. So for that, he is revered in churches. And if you go to conferences of ministers and they find out you're from the Shrine, you're pretty much a celebrity because of that legacy.
Right. And also, can you speak to the institutions that he helped found, or he founded? The Holy Order of the Maccabees, Black Slate, the Cultural Center, the unveiling of the Black Madonna and Child. Can you speak to the importance of those and how those laid a blueprint for other churches, other movements that they may recognize or may not recognize where that inspiration came from?
Well, I mean, it's important to understand that the Shrine has never been a gigantic church in terms of numbers. What it has been a gigantic church in terms of influence, in terms of influence and direction, in terms of bringing churches away from a purely spiritual interpretation of life and trying to have them deal with a broader spectrum of concerns. One of the most obvious things is just like the Black Madonna on the wall. I remember back in the 70s, Creflo Dollar was like giving us a hard time about a Black Madonna, a Black Messiah. And I was about 3-4 years ago, I saw him on a TV program where he was in his office and he had a picture of the Black Madonna up on the wall. So if we can bring him that far, then we've done a lot to bring black people that far. I think people don't understand that the introduction of a Black Messiah was as controversial as a black man being president at the time that it was introduced. So it was something unheard of and shocking and audacious. And I think it kind of spread our consciousness a little bit. And this consciousness has led to institutional manifestations, like you mentioned, the Black Slate, which is still active and influential. The Culture Center grew out of the Black Arts Festival, where national black artists came together, and they came together for the first 2 years in the Shrine in Detroit. And it brought together all artists, intellectuals, authors, and they displayed what they did, sold their books. But before the Culture Center, there was no place for a black person to sell a book. There was no place for a black artist to sell art. And so what the Black Arts Festival did was crystallize the need to build an institution that could do this day in and day out all the time. And so that's what we've done. As a matter of fact, next year will be the 50th anniversary of the Shrine of the Black Madonna Culture Center. And when I say influential church, I mean like all the people that we've influenced, not just through the church, but through the Cultural Center. There's a great deal of appreciation for enlightenment. I mean, even Beyonce's mother says that her children's consciousness comes from the influence of the Shrine Culture Center. But that's true. Politicians, people I meet all the time, people have gone to Atlanta University Center at Morehouse or Spelman, Clark. They spent time in the Culture Center and they talk about how it changed their lives and their interpretation of what it meant to be a black person.
And all the big names, the Afrocentric scholars.
Oh, well, everybody that's anybody between 1970 and the present, they came through the Culture Center. And so part of what we want to do with the 50th anniversary is we want to have celebrations in each city where we kind of celebrate what we have been to a community. So we're trying to make it not just an internal church celebration, but to make it a public celebration in each city of the contribution that the Culture Center has made to the community. So there are all kind of institutions, but they basically grow out of the mentality that a church has to be more than a place where we pray. That a church ought to be with that, what our interpretation of what a church ought to be, it ought to be 10% spiritual and 90% everything else. And so we try to create a church that can do that. And we have some challenges ahead, but that's what the future is about, trying to create the kind of church we want to be. 10% spiritual, 90% economic, political, agricultural, cultural, child development, educational, to make all those other manifestations of community life live and be independent.
Amen, amen. Can we do one more question? Since Theodore said yes, we're going to do one more question. 1953 to 1973, 20 years, but the church went through a great transformation in that time. So how could you, is there a way that you can describe that period in a brief few words?
Wow. Well, in the beginning, it was a traditional church it was a traditional church except for its social activity, its level of social activity. Then Jim Moody recognized that I'm not going to be able to take these older members and turn them into the kind of Christians that I want to be involved in a struggle to give complete commitment to a struggle to change our condition. So he started focusing on young people, and he had to build up the largest youth fellowship in the state of Michigan. And that was where he spent his time: dance, art, sports, working with young people, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, working with young people, like having camps, in order to get them to come to a different understanding of what it meant to be Christian. And that's like through the 50s, that's what he was building. But by the 60s, those kids had grown up, and they were now going to college. They were adults, and so the 60s we became a different kind of church. And he started preaching black nationalism in the late 50s. He coined the phrase black theology in 1953, but he started preaching black nationalism in the late 50s, and by the early 60s, that's all he was preaching. And so he began to attract a different kind of member. And people who weren't even traditionally Christian came to hear this message of black nationalism. And when you match that with his social activity, fighting for the school board, fighting the school board, fighting the police department, those two things came together, and he attracted people that were interested in that. So by the time of the late 60s, the Shrine of the Black Madonna was a spiritual home of the conscious people throughout the city of Detroit. Anybody thinking of it, people that didn't even want to go to church, they wanted to come to the shrine because it was a crossroads where everybody, like-minded, conscious people, were talking, fussing, debating, but it was a place where they could come together and felt like it was their home. And so if they were going to go to church, they were going to come to the shrine.
Can you put our hands together for that powerful word? This is part one of our anniversary month, Liberation Dialogue. We'll see you back next week. Give our presiding bishop a hand one more time.